Hello, students. Welcome to study ecological succession with me. In this moment, we are going to talk about the two types of ecological succession, primary succession and secondary succession. What is succession? Succession is a series of changes that occur over time in order of sequences or in the course of events. When we see ecological succession or when we bring this succession on ecosystem, what we call ecological succession, this is a gradual process in which ecosystems change and develop over time since ecosystem is dynamic. That means the ecosystems that exist today did not always exist. They have developed from other previous ecosystems through succession. Based on their starting points, ecological succession can be primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is a series of community changes which occur on an entirely new habitat which has never been colonized before. This primary succession, based on the parts of the earth where it starts on, it can be xerospheres and hydrospheres. Xerospheres means a types of primary succession in which a series of community changes occur on bare rock or bare ground, whereas hydrospheres are another series of community changes that get happen on aquatic environment or open water that has never been colonized by any forms of life before. This primary succession can happen on places where volcano erupts, glaciers or snows melt and retreat, a place where flooded by severe soil erosion, a place where landslides, a place where nuclear explodes, and a place where oil spills. These are the places in which living organisms get absent and they started to grow or flourish for the first time. When living organisms start to flourish for the first time, we call that primary succession. Let us study characteristics of primary succession. Primary succession has its own pioneer species. These pioneer species are the first species that populate on the area that has never been colonized before. Since these organisms are highly resistant to certain harsh conditions, we call them extremely resilient organisms. Since they are resilient or resistant to harsh conditions, they able to colonize harsh environment and reproduce there. The first pioneer species in primary succession are lichens. Lichens do not need soil to survive. They can be seen growing on surfaces of the rocks. The next species that colonize the area next to lichen are mosses. Mosses grow to hold newly made soil. Lichens can change harsh or non-suitable abiotic conditions and make this condition less harsh or a little bit suitable for other organisms. Lichens grow for the first time on rock and crumble it. When these lichens die, decomposers act on the dead remains and release mineral ions that confined within the body of lichens into the crumbled rock. Then primitive soil gets developed from dead remains of lichens, the crumbled rocks, and mineral ions that were released from crumbled rock and dead remains. Then mosses start to grow on this less harsh environment because lichens get modified this harsh environmental condition and make it suitable to mosses. So spores of mosses that land there can now germinate and mosses grow and flourish by outcompeting lichens that were there. That means by outcompeting or avoiding lichens, simple plants like mosses and ferns start to grow in this newly developed soil. Simple plants die and adding more organic nutrients or mineral substances to the soil. This accumulation of mineral substances on the soil gets the soil layer thicks and the bedrocks become thin due to crumbling. So then grasses, wildflowers, and other plants begin to grow in this habitat. These plants again die and they add more nutrients to the soil. When the soil thickness and soil fertility gets high, shrubs and trees can survive in this habitat. Insects, small birds, mammals have begun to move into the area and start to flourish. What was once bare rock now supports a variety of living organisms. Each stage of succession, from starting or colonization to climax community, is called series. As you can see from the diagram, when the soil thickness and quality increase and beds of rock get thin or decrease from left to right, a series of community development gets higher and higher until climax community of the ecosystem reach. That means lichens grow and make the abiotic conditions suitable to mosses. Mosses in turn modify abiotic condition, create more chance for perennial herbs to grow there and flourish. These perennial herbs in turn also change the abiotic conditions and make the ecosystem more good for scrubs and forests. When I say here abiotic conditions, you have to remember soil quality, soil depths, moisture levels of the soil, the temperature, and certain gases which is valuable for living organisms and so on. What we have discussed before is succession on bare rock, what we call xerosphere. Let us see succession from open water or hydrosphere. The open water area may have little organisms due to the presence of planktons, but how can this area change to climax woodland ecosystem through succession or series of abiotic and biotic changes? At the first stage, soil and dead organisms can be added to the open water by erosion and form sediment at the bottom layers of the open water. Then, submerged plants and some small organisms grow or established on these sediments. This increases the amount of sediment as these organisms die and larger plants become established. As time passes, more and more sediments fill the lake and larger emerging plants become to established or grow. Eventually, there is sufficient sediment to support deep-rooted trees or deep-rooted plants. Then this open water area now gets changed to climax woodland. The essence or natural characteristics of succession. Organisms must colonize an area. These organisms can change the abiotic condition or physical environment. The changed abiotic conditions create a probability or chances for other organisms to colonize the area. Then the new species outcompete or avoid the ones before there and become dominant in this habitat or in this area. These new species or new groups of organisms in turn change the abiotic conditions and create another more probability for more new species to enter, and this process then continue in this way until the climax community of the environment gets reached. The second type of succession based on its starting area is secondary succession. Secondary succession is a series of community changes which takes place on previously uncolonized but disturbed or damaged habitat. That means this succession begins on a place that already has soil and was once the home of living organisms. When we see the speed of this succession to reach climax community and its pioneer species. Secondary succession occurs faster than primary succession and has different pioneer species than primary succession. The pioneer species in case of secondary succession is annual herbs because this secondary succession not starting from bedrock or open water. It simply starts on the ground or the area that has soil. And in this area, there is also seed bank of many of the climax plant types available in remaining undamaged plants inside the soil. Secondary succession mostly occurs after forest fires when the farmers ploughing a field and some other human interventions. Certain plants have adapted to regular cycles of fire and they can regrow. In a sense, means they can place their seeds or seed banks within the soil which cannot be damaged unless exposed to fire. As you can see from the diagram, the community of organisms is just damaged by any factors, in this case fire, and the area becomes blank. But as you see, this blank area has soil and there may be seed bank, mostly underground seeds that can be parts of the vegetative plants, cannot be burned by fire and remain hidden. When the conditions become suitable or when they get enough moisture, they start to grow there. The pioneer species in case of secondary succession is annual herbs. These annual herbs start to grow on this blank area after a certain years later. These annual plants or annual herbs die and increase the soil quality of this area. When the soil quality gets high, it creates probability for grasses and perennial herbs grow there. Then these organisms, as usual, die there, increase the soil quality, nutrient values of the area, and creates more probabilities for certain larger plants like grasses, shrubs, pine trees, young oaks, hickory, and etc. So then, when the time passes, soil thickness and quality, moisture level becomes high. Due to this reason, the community of organisms become more populated and stable. In a sense, climax community rich in this ecosystem. The following trends occur in any succession. The total biomass of the community gets increased from year to year. The species diversity increase from time to time or from year to year. The number of ecological niches or set of interaction or what we call role of organisms in an ecosystem becomes high and complex. Food webs become more complex. The community of organisms become more stable since they reach to climax community. What is climax community? Climax community means a mature, stable community of organisms that does not undergo further succession. Climax community does not always mean big trees or jungle forest. This climax community can be grasses in prairies and cacti in deserts. There are certain factors that could influence the type of climax community formed. These factors are temperature, precipitation, soil type, soil depths, and biotic factors that can determine what type of climax community gets happen in a given ecosystem. For example, when the temperature, precipitation, soil type, soil quality, soil depths, the interaction of biotic factors are beyond optimum, the climax community may be jungle forest. But in contrast, when all these situations or factors, what we mentioned before, gets low or below the optimum level, the climax community might be grasses or cacti.